Israel says it has killed the head of Islamic Jihad's rocket force in an early morning air raid on Gaza. He's the fourth Palestinian militant commander to be killed in Israeli strikes on Gaza this week. Egypt was trying to broker a ceasefire in what's become the worst bout of fighting between Israel and Palestinian militants in months.
Hundreds take part in the funeral of Palestinian militant leader Ali Ghali. The commander of the Islamic Jihad group's rocket launch unit was killed, along with his brother, overnight in Gaza. He becomes the fourth senior member of the group to be targeted and killed by Israeli military strikes this week. The Israeli Defense Forces says it also targeted military posts in Gaza belonging to Islamic Jihad. The group is designated a terrorist organisation by Israel, the EU and others. The strikes followed hours of intense rocket attacks by Islamic Jihad from Gaza. According to the Israeli military, many were shot down by Israel's Iron Dome defence system. But others caused damage in Israeli cities like Ashkelon, although no injuries or deaths were reported there.
Unfortunately, every 2 days we suffer from this. I really hope this will be the end and that our government will wake up and we will hit them with what they deserve.
In Gaza, civilians were also caught up in the crossfire. This week, several civilians, including young children, have died. Across the Gaza Strip, streets are empty.
People are unable to work normally. And at night, we can't sleep because of the worry of bombardment and the news of what's going on.
While hopes rest on Egypt brokering a ceasefire, civilians on both sides are left surveying the damage.
Let's bring in our team on the ground. DW correspondent Rebecca Ritters is in the Israeli town of Ashkelon, just north of Gaza. And across that border in Gaza City is journalist Sophie van der Taan. Welcome to you both. Rebecca, bring us up to date on developments in Israel. What's happening where you are?
Well, things on the Israeli side, Terry, were pretty quiet overnight. There was about an 8-hour lull in rocket fire, but things started to pick up a bit this morning. The sirens once again ringing from about 8 a.m. local time. Now, we have official figures. We have at least 10 mortars have been fired across the border. Most landed in empty areas or were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome system, though 2 were had reportedly landed near residential areas, causing some minor damage. No casualties have been reported, though the IDF has also continued its campaign today. Earlier, we heard some F-16s flying overhead, and then we heard some explosions. Then it was confirmed, or the IDF said, that they had attacked an anti-tank missile launcher and a mortar launch post belonging to the Islamic Jihad. So continuing today, but much quieter than things were yesterday. Security services on this side, the security services and the IDF say they are expecting potentially some retaliatory fire following the attack last night of an Islamic Jihad militant and 2 operatives that were killed. But so far, we haven't seen anything in that direction.
Sophie, you're in Gaza City. Israeli airstrikes have killed another commander from Islamic Jihad. What can you tell us about that?
So despite talks about a possible ceasefire, we've heard fighting continue in the early hours of the morning. Israel killed the head of the Islamic Jihad rocket program and 2 further Islamic Jihad operatives. Other than that, there have not been reported any further casualties, civilian casualties, because of Israeli attacks. There have also been further rockets launched from Gaza. Right now, the Egyptian, Qatari and UN mediators are trying to negotiate a ceasefire. However, Islamic Jihad has put forward 3 conditions for the ceasefire. First condition is that Israel stops the targeted killings in Gaza and the West Bank. Second condition, that Israel returns the body of Khada Adnan, the Palestinian prisoner that died of a hunger strike in an Israeli prison last week. And third, that Israel cancels the flag march that's scheduled for next week. According to Israeli sources, none of these conditions can be met from the Israeli side, though.
Sophie, Rebecca, stay with us while we take a closer look at the situation in the Gaza Strip.
The Gaza Strip, one of the world's most densely populated territories and one of the most fought over. Israel took control of Gaza and other territories in the 1967 Six-Day War with Arab countries. Israel ended its occupation of Gaza in 2005 as part of internationally brokered agreements to return control to Palestinians. Elections a year later brought the militant group Hamas, a designated terrorist organization, to power in the Gaza Strip. Hamas has refused to renounce violence and does not recognize Israel's right to exist. Israel responded by cutting off direct aid and permanently imposed a blockade in 2007 intended to stop weapons deliveries. Gaza's 2 million residents are largely dependent on international aid. Gaza is also home to another terrorist organization, Islamic Jihad, which is sworn to destroying Israel and receives funding from Iran. Militant groups have repeatedly launched rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel, prompting retaliatory strikes. 2 years ago, the fighting escalated into a war lasting 11 days. The violence has caused death and destruction on both sides of the border.
Sophie, there are multiple militant groups in the Gaza Strip. The latest violence involves the Islamic Jihad, but what about Hamas, the militant group that rules Gaza? That group has been designated as a terrorist group by many countries. Are Hamas staying on the sidelines in this latest escalation?
So generally speaking, Islamic Jihad coordinates with Hamas. Hamas knows what's going on. There are joint statements of the militant factions here, but it seems like Hamas is staying outside of the fighting. They're enabling Islamic Jihad to operate at all, but they're not actively involved in the fighting. The assumption is that Hamas is not interested in a fully fledged escalation because they know that if they get involved, fighting will get longer, it will get harder, and the suffering and the damage in Gaza will get higher. And they've seen it in 2021 with a big escalation, with a war in Gaza, what that means for the people here who already live in very dire conditions. And Hamas is simply also worried about losing popular support. So there's definitely also a political interest here. That's the assumption, at least, that Hamas is not interested in letting this fully escalate.
Rebecca, as we've already heard, there are some efforts being made at peace negotiations. There are reports of a potential ceasefire in the works. Does that look likely?
Well, even as early as yesterday, we were hearing reports in Egyptian media. Now, so if you mentioned Egypt is a key player in the ceasefire negotiations, and we heard in the Egyptian media that a ceasefire had in fact been agreed. Now, that obviously didn't actually unfold, and that wasn't the case because there were some conditions that weren't met that Sophie mentioned that Islamic Jihad were demanding. Now, today we've heard some conflicting reports. Al Arabiya, one of the Arabic networks, has said that in fact Israel was going to agree and that they wanted a ceasefire, but we've since heard from Israeli sources that that isn't the case. So we're getting a lot of conflicting reports back and forth. The negotiations are ongoing. The US has also weighed in, saying that they would like to see a de-escalation, but so far efforts have failed. An Islamic Jihad political leader is in Cairo for those negotiations, and it's really anyone's guess what will happen. Of course, the citizens, as Sophie was just mentioning, and both in Israel and in Gaza, would like to see some kind of ceasefire as soon as possible. We have to wait and see, I'm afraid.
Rebecca Ritters there in Ashkelon, just north of Gaza, and in Gaza City. Sophie van der Taan, thank you very much to you both. This latest flare-up in violence comes exactly 1 year after the death of Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh. She was a highly respected U.S. Palestinian journalist. She was shot and killed while reporting on a raid by the Israeli military near Jenin, a city in the occupied West Bank. During the operation, there was a firefight between Israeli troops and Palestinian militants. Although there has been no official confirmation on who fired the fatal shot, the U.S. security coordinator concluded that gunfire from Israeli Defense Forces positions was likely responsible. To mark the anniversary of Shireen Abu Akleh's death, DW Jerusalem correspondent Tanya Kramer has been talking to her brother.
Her sign-off was famous. The Palestinian-American correspondent was a household name across the region. For 25 years, Shireen Abu Akleh reported from the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel for Al Jazeera Arabic.
شيرين أبو عقلة الجزيرة القدس المحتلة.
A year ago, she was shot and killed while covering a raid by the Israeli military near Jenin, a northern city in the occupied West Bank. Every week, her brother Anton Abu Akleh visits her grave in Jerusalem. The pain of losing his sister and the lack of accountability for her death weigh on his mind.
1 year after, we are still hoping to achieve justice. We are still pursuing justice for Shireen. Unfortunately, still after all this time, we're still trying to pursue justice and hold whoever is responsible for her killing accountable.
Her killing in the early morning on May 11th was partially recorded on video by other Palestinian journalists. Abu Akleh had been shot in the side of her head. She was wearing a protective vest and helmet marked press. The young bystander tried to help. The shooting continued.
All these media reports from CNN, Al Jazeera, Bet Salem even, United Nations also report was released, New York Times, all these came up with that an Israeli sniper was responsible for shooting her and killing her. Some even stressed that she was targeted.
Initially, the Israeli government blamed Palestinian militants for the killing and claimed the journalists were caught in crossfire. But several investigations by the media, human rights groups and the UN determined that the fatal shot likely came from Israeli forces. The Israeli army declined to be interviewed for this report and referred to its own investigation that was concluded in September 2022.
Following the completion of a series of investigations carried out by a dedicated task force, it appears that it is not possible to unequivocally determine the source of gunfire which hit Ms. Abu Akleh. However, there is a high possibility that Ms. Abu Akleh was accidentally hit by Israel Defense Forces gunfire that was fired toward suspects identified as armed Palestinian gunmen during an exchange of fire in which life-risking, widespread shots were fired towards Israel Defense Forces soldiers.
Nearly as shocking as her death was the police violence that marred her funeral. Thousands had gathered in occupied East Jerusalem to pay their last respects. Israeli border police charged into the crowd as her body was carried out of the hospital morgue, beating pallbearers and mourners. Abu Akleh's family and her colleagues at Al Jazeera are seeking various routes for justice. The FBI in the United States has opened an investigation. In addition, 2 petitions were submitted to the International Criminal Court.
Without the cooperation of the Israeli police or the Israeli army, it's a big challenge, and it will take time. But for us, for the family, there is nothing will bring Shireen back. So we had to pursue this at the extent to ensure that this is not repeated again.
Her family is hoping for the kind of accountability they believe Shireen would have pushed for if she were still alive.
Let's bring in Robert Mahoney here. He's Director of Special Projects with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Welcome to the program. Now, it's been a year since Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. Are you satisfied, Robert, with the investigations into her death?
Well, like the family and the broader journalism community know, because the investigation into her death took 5 months and came up empty-handed. No one has been held accountable. No one has been held responsible for her shooting.
What about the findings of the Israeli military that she was, with high possibility, shot by an Israeli soldier who had misidentified her as a militant? Do you accept that finding?
Well, she, like a lot of the journalists that we at the Committee to Protect Journalists have identified in the report that we've just written, was wearing press insignia. She was wearing a protective vest with the words press in bright, clear, white lettering front and back. So whoever took a shot at her was very likely to have been able to read that, we believe. And that's why we're pressing for proper investigations into these killings, because we have identified 20 killings similar to that of Shireen Abu Akleh over the last 2 decades that Palestinians have been reporting from the West Bank and Gaza.
You mentioned it, the 20 killings, 20 journalists killed in Israeli military operations over the past 22 years, I think. Do you see a common thread to those investigations into the killings?
Yes, the anniversary today of Shireen's killing prompted us to revisit all those cases. And we came up with a common thread, which we have, in our report, we've titled the report Deadly Pattern. And I've come here to Jerusalem to present it to the Israeli government, because there is a pattern where we see in 13 of the cases of the dead journalists, as I say, they were wearing press insignia, and also in 13 cases, witness testimony was discounted, inquiries, investigations weren't carried out thoroughly. And so the thing that comes out of all these is that we believe the entire process is designed not to hold somebody accountable. In other words, the killing of Shireen was not a one-off instance. It's part of a pattern of lack of accountability and a lack of transparency on the part of the Israel Defense Forces.
So you see a pattern over a period of over 2 decades. What can be done then to achieve greater transparency and accountability in investigating the deaths of journalists in the region?
Well, several things. One is to bring pressure to bear on the Israelis to review their rules of engagement about how they deal with civilians in the West Bank and Gaza, which, let's remember, is under Israeli military occupation, so that they do not resort to live fire as a first option. Secondly, we would like to see the one investigation that is underway come to a conclusion. The FBI is investigating the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh because she was an American citizen as well as a Palestinian. And we would like the United States to provide an update on where they are with that investigation, which was opened last November, and to bring pressure to bear on Israel to cooperate with that investigation, because so far Israel has refused to cooperate.
And just a clarification, Gaza, of course, is under control of the Hamas militant group, which doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. Robert Mahoney from the Committee to Protect Journalists, thank you very much.
Thank you.